Protection Agency. We'd like to welcome you and thank you for your participation. It's exciting that groups of people are gathered at more than 600 sites across the country, in Canada, Puerto Rico, and a number of sites in Brazil to learn more about protecting their drinking water sources. Drinking water is vitally important to all communities, and we commend your interest in participating in the video workshop. To gain an understanding of key protection mechanisms available to you at the local level. As we and others have found from our work over the years, responsibility for protecting drinking water sources rests in the community. And we're glad you're using this opportunity as a catalyst to come together and find workable solutions to protect your drinking water sources. A sense of community is what it's all about, working together to plan for the future and address local needs. And now, Administrator Browner would like to say a few words.
Thank you, Becky, and let me join you in welcoming everyone to this video workshop. I want to commend you and the League of Women Voters for putting together this video conference. We at EPA are delighted to work with you to help people in our communities become more directly involved in protecting their drinking water. Citizens have the right to know that their drinking water is safe and that their water supplies are protected from pollution. Over the past several years, EPA has worked vigorously to increase public awareness and public involvement in drinking water protection. The new Safe Drinking Water Act amendments, which President Clinton proposed and signed into law last year, not only strengthen that protection, but they also provide greater opportunities for community partnerships. Partnerships designed to help ensure that tap water is clean and safe to drink. For example, the new Source Water Assessment Program will assure that you get the information you need about potential threats to your local water supplies, and maybe even some federal money to help you deal with them. The new law has many other components designed to help communities take action to ensure safe, clean water to drink. But your involvement is the most important of all. And that's why I am so delighted that so many are participating in this innovative video conference. Again, I want to thank the League of Women Voters for making it happen. And I look forward to working with all of you in the days to come.
Thank you, Carol. We hope that you will leave the workshop with some key ideas and strategies that you can apply in your community. In that way, community by community, we can create a national movement to protect our drinking water. And now, ladies and gentlemen, please turn your attention to the program.
We strive very hard to be sure that we maintain an adequate water supply that's safe, that's properly treated, so that we feel that this is something that we owe to destiny, to the future of our children, and to the future of the community.
Pristine source of water that is excellent tasting water, and we intend to keep it that way if we possibly can. It's a precious resource, and if we spoil it, then of course we'd have to bear the consequences of that.
You have a number of jurisdictions that have come together, actually along with the state, to take action on management and preservation and protection to make certain that we deal with both point and non-point sources of pollution. This has been in place for a number of years now, and it's really just, again, a consensus of people on the management side that protecting these reservoirs are very important.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tools for Drinking Water Protection, a video conference sponsored by the League of Women Voters Education Fund. The program is being viewed in more than 700 sites throughout the U.S., with sites in Canada and Brazil. So welcome, everyone. The goal of this video conference is to introduce you and your community to specific management techniques that, when implemented and used properly, can protect your sources of drinking water. During this 90-minute conference, we're going to talk specifically about 4 of these key strategies or starting points: land use planning, public education, monitoring, and contingency planning. Through a series of contrasting case studies, we'll see how 3 very different communities implemented these strategies successfully. And because each community is unique, we'll need to understand the thinking and process that go into making these programs successful. The 3 communities that we will focus on today are Baltimore, Maryland, a metropolitan area using reservoir water; Renton, Washington, a suburban community using groundwater; and Sweeney, Texas, a rural community also using groundwater. We'll also be talking with a panel of experts who will share their expertise about techniques that have worked across the country. Although we won't be covering every method that's available, we'll highlight some key approaches and some important starting points. Now, as outlined in the background material for this program, we've made some basic assumptions about the remote site audience and what you already know. We're assuming that you know where your drinking water comes from and that you're familiar with the wellhead or watershed boundaries you need to protect, and that you've already seen a contaminant source inventory of the area and you can identify potential risks. Now, for those of you who are in the first stages of this process, today's video conference should energize your efforts and help get you to the next step. And it's for those of you who are developing a drinking water protection plan or who already have a successful program in place. Well, today's discussion will help reinforce what you're doing and provide you with some new strategies. I'd like to point out a valuable resource currently available to you. Just look around the room. You probably see members of your own community or nearby communities use each other as a resource to help you implement the new strategies we'll be highlighting here today. But before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to introduce you to a special guest, Ms. Valerie A. Lemmy, City Manager, Dayton, Ohio. Valerie, thanks for joining us, and tell us, how did Dayton get to the forefront of drinking water protection?
Thank you, Doris. Dayton, Ohio is a wonderful place to live, where we literally walk on water. You guessed it, the downtown is above the aquifer. And Dayton is defined by innovation, the home of the Wright brothers and the Dayton Peace Accords. With a history of innovation and an eagerness to enhance our environment, 10 years ago, citizens from all facets of our community accepted the challenge of protecting our drinking water. The mid-1980s brought sobering times to Dayton. Test data were beginning to show that some of our groundwater had fallen victim to past failures, including improper waste disposal and a land use plan that was far from protective of our groundwater resources. We were learning the importance of groundwater monitoring to provide an early warning of impending problems. Then, in the late 1980s, we experienced firsthand the value of good contingency planning when a major fire erupted at a paint warehouse near some of our drinking water wells. Good communications between water department staff and emergency responders from the fire department proved to be essential for successful emergency management. But perhaps most importantly, concerned members of our community became educated and eagerly pursued a solution, one which would minimize existing threats and prevent new threats to our drinking water wells. And although we were willing to make sacrifices, we believed that these goals could be achieved in ways that would sustain our economic vitality, and we did it. Today we have a comprehensive program that includes dozens of tools which protect the raw water which serves as our source of drinking water. The foundation of our program is land use controls that limit future uses of the land to those with a level of risk acceptable to our community. Additionally, neighboring communities which share the geography of our well-fill protection area voluntarily establish comparable land use controls. This despite the tensions typical of virtually every urban-suburban setting. Our educational efforts are dynamic. They're constantly evolving. There is one constant, however. No stone is left unturned in our efforts to use education to maintain community involvement and support. So mostly what you'll see in Dayton are what US EPA refers to as community-based common sense initiatives, or what we at the local level of government call our way of doing business. Doris?
Thank you, Valerie. Unfortunately, Valerie has a meeting that she needs to attend back in Dayton, so if you have any specific questions for her, please fax them or email them. It turns out that our first panelist is from Dayton also, so I'd like to introduce you to them now. Joining us to discuss these issues is a panel of experts in drinking water protection. Meet Douglas Dusty Hall, Environmental Protection Manager for Dayton, Ohio. Bonnie Holtz, Director of Environmental Health, Brown Nicollet Environmental Health, St. Peter, Minnesota. Ken Lustig, Director of Environmental Health, Panhandle Health District, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And John Witten, President, Horsley and Witten Incorporated, Boston, Massachusetts. And I'd like to say welcome to all of you and thank you for being with us. One of the key tools now used in communities is land use planning. Does everyone address land use planning in the same way? Let's look at how 3 communities implemented land use planning as an integral part of their water protection programs.
Our aquifer protection program closely mimics the federal and state wellhead protection program requirements. We have assessed the susceptibility of our aquifer via a number of scientific studies. We have delineated a wellhead protection area. We've done an inventory of sources of contamination in the community, and based on that inventory, we did a plan that has guided us for many years in the steps we've taken to protect the aquifer. We have a risk management program basically based on that process. We have coordination with our emergency responders, and we have planned a backup supply to deal with possible contamination of our main supply.
We realized the importance of our resource, and our program started with an education program and then went from the education program into an ordinance and regulations. When we talked to the businesses, we went out, and the first thing we did was inventory the businesses that existed in our aquifer protection area. We got a list of those businesses. We went and visited those businesses to determine what kinds of practices they had, what kind of housekeeping they did, what kinds of materials, how much of hazardous chemicals that they had on site. And with that knowledge, then we could assist them in areas such as reduction. In other words, let's have as little hazardous materials on site as possible. Perhaps alternate products. Can we use something else that's less hazardous? And also containment, so positive engineering type controls. We talked to the businesses about best management practices, what they could do to reduce the risk of a spill or a leak that might lead then to contamination.
The Wellhead Protection Program in Texas is a voluntary program. It's not mandated by the state or the EPA. It's one of those programs that you can do to help yourself out, and it just makes sense to do it, and there's 100 reasons to do it and very few not to. The state doesn't put any requirements on you to participate. They have certain guidelines that they like to go by, and this just gives you some directions to start out in. Then each community throughout the state, even close-knitted communities, they're going to be different. Each community has to set its own goals and what its program needs to be. You have some communities like ours, which is a bedroom community, has very little commercial, no industry. You have other communities that they're mostly commercial and industry. So each program is going to be different. They just give you basic guidelines to get you started.
It has always been of prime importance to the officials and the citizens of the community. This was something that we foresaw as being a way to protect our underground water supply and anything that led to any contaminants being there. We've always strived to try to locate where those were and eliminate them if possible. The Wellhead Protection Program was not meant to be any type of a deterrent to those people who wanted to maintain their individual water wells, but mainly to be sure that they were taken care of, that they were drilled, if they were abandoned, that they were abandoned in the proper manner.
You know, land use and land management does play an important role in water quality. Forestry, conservation lands, and farmland with good conservation practices and best management practices, cover crops, conservation tillage, all those things are very important in water quality. From a land management standpoint, you know, what a farmer does in his farm is important, and it's a voluntary effort. So, as I said, the soil conservation districts work with the farmer to help lay out a plan that is protective of water quality. Local jurisdictions in Maryland have primary land use responsibilities in terms of their comprehensive plans and zoning. And part of the reservoir program is to encourage water quality and reservoir protection to be included in the determination of land uses.
All right, John is going to help start the discussion on land use. Go for it, John.
Thank you, Doris. It's a pleasure to be here and be part of this distinguished panel. The video clips beg an important question. What is land use planning? I believe it consists of three parts. First, common sense. We know or should know that what occurs on the land's surface will ultimately impact on water quality. For example, we know or should know that locating a sewage treatment plant or a landfill or a high-density residential development or an industrial park within a wellhead protection area will likely contaminate groundwater supplies. Common sense means planning and acting to protect groundwater from contamination. Second, land use planning is power. It is understanding and using the powers granted to local and county governments by their respective states. I've often heard local officials and residents complain that the state or federal government isn't doing enough for them regarding resource protection. The problem, of course, is that these local officials and residents are overlooking the tremendous power that they have to protect their natural resources. The ultimate responsibility for protecting groundwater supplies rests with local government. Take advantage of the powers you've been granted. They are numerous and extremely effective if used correctly. Third and finally, land use planning is public participation and outreach. Now, Ken will cover this in more detail in a few minutes, but for now, let's define public participation and outreach as including within a community's planning program those individuals or organizations that are perceived as opponents to land use planning or the imposition of new regulations. Public participation also includes supporting organizations that promote groundwater quality, including the League of Women Voters and the Groundwater Foundation in Lincoln, Nebraska. So, what is land use planning? It's common sense, it's power, and it's public education. Ken?
Yeah, I think when we talk about land use planning, we need to remember that land use plans reflect the values of a community. There's a wonderful line from the Cheshire Cat that says, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. You know, and the function of a land use plan is to decide where do we want to go. You know, there's some different strategies you can use. There are some who believe that proper siting is most important, you know, to protect the resource. And there are others that say you shouldn't deny an activity, should establish criteria by which the activity must be conducted under. So there are different ways to approach it, but I think it's most important that you get the members and the facets of the community together and decide what are we trying to accomplish here. It's not one to the exclusion of the others.
Ken, you raised an excellent point about siting, and in Dayton, in our program and in our region, in fact, we feel that that's the critical single primary protective measure. You heard Manager Lemmy mention zoning as the foundation of our program. The interesting part about zoning, however, is if the sources are already there, then you've got an uphill battle to fight, but there are still tools that you can use. Conservation easement acquisition, for example, is one that we use, and we also have financial incentives for, had I dare say it, engineering controls.
Well, I think there's another aspect, too, in that when you do land use planning, you have to agree on some definitions. One of the ones that, when we worked on the comprehensive plan in Kootenai County, one of the things we worked on was, people use the term like quality of life. And there's a wonderful essay for those of you who want to look it up by Wagner called Growth and the Quality of Life, and it's really informative in that he defines the quality of life as not only the economy, you know, but the experiences and services that a community wants. So if you come to some agreement that quality of life will accept this definition, then as you work your way through your plan, you can say, does this fulfill our definition of ensuring or improving the quality of life? Because, you know, the common misconception is that we all function in the same reality, that we all have the same definition for words. And I think it's important to find some of those keywords, come to a common understanding of what that definition is, and then use those as touchstones as you start wrestling with these different ideas and programs.
Could I bring up a point about Minnesota?
Well, of course.
Minnesota, as many of you may know, is the land of 10,000 lakes, and we have a planning process in place in Minnesota called county water planning, where we emphasize the water resource. And every one of Minnesota's 87 counties gathers together the participants, as John mentioned, and everyone throws their own ideas out, and then the county writes a comprehensive plan, prioritizes goals, and actually develops action steps to reach those goals. And it's been quite successful in building partnerships to get to some of these points, but it's voluntary.
Bonnie, you mentioned the fact that sometimes you need more coverage than just maybe one single jurisdiction can offer, and obviously county agencies are a wonderful place to get that support. In our region, we have a regional planning agency, and I'm sure there are many more of those out there that can be helpful in assisting programs that want to adopt land use controls or other types of strategies, educational, whatever, that need to extend beyond one jurisdiction. It's a popular misconception that you can't extend land use controls beyond your jurisdiction. Well, of course you can, and it's a matter of going to your regional planning agency, getting their support, or some other multi-jurisdictional agency and making it happen.
Mm-hmm. The range of techniques are so broad and so opportunistic that it seems that every local government should embrace a regulatory strategy or a non-regulatory strategy or a combination of both, but to not do anything, to simply rely on the assumption that people will protect groundwater on their own is false. We found that certainly in Canada, and we found that in this country as well. The opportunities are very, very broad, and the techniques, the tools, the strategies are so able and empowering for local governments that they need to be seized, they need to be taken advantage of.
Ken?
Yeah, and there are a whole host of available literature and options and models to work from out there. You know, I plug John's book here, but you did a book for, it was American Planning Association or on wellhead protection. It is a good primer, gives some good fundamental ideas. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can start applying some of these things in your community, or at least they become places to start the discussion from, so that you don't ask people to explain things they don't, you know, they need some definition, some place to start from.
All right. Before we take some questions, I would like to remind you that with over 700 sites, you might get a busy signal, so just keep trying. And please remember that when you do get through and you ask your question, turn the volume down on your television set so we don't get feedback. We're going to start taking your telephone calls now, and I have a stack of questions that came to us by fax and from the internet. So let's go to the first question. This is Peter Thurston, Eugene, Oregon. And Peter says, the Northwest receives 5 to 10 feet of rainfall a year. This provides plenty of water in most watersheds to meet human population needs. How do we link drinking water source protection issues with watershed management? John?
Good question. Drinking water protection, wellhead protection, is a subset of watershed management, a subset of watershed protection. And we've learned the hard way over the past 10, 20 years that if you focus solely on the wellhead, solely on the zone of contribution, or the wellhead protection area, you're often missing the bigger picture. You're missing the aquifer that supplies, that feeds the groundwater that you're withdrawing for public supply. So what we've learned, again, the hard way, is to look at the bigger picture, the watershed, the surface area that contributes recharge to our groundwater supplies. Now, as Dusty mentioned, the watershed, in many cases, is going to be multi-jurisdictional. For those of you in large rural areas, perhaps it's several counties involved, several communities. That's true in more urban areas as well, where we're dealing with multiple cities and towns and counties. But we have to look at the bigger picture if we're to protect groundwater holistically. And it makes sense. That's one of the purposes we're here today to talk about, is what are those techniques? What are the strategies? Well, one strategy is to look at the big picture. Don't focus solely on the well itself. Look at the watershed.
All right. Thanks, John. Let's take a telephone call. Our first call comes to us from the Undersecretary of Agriculture. Thank you for calling.
Sir, good afternoon. This is Tom Hebert. It's a pleasure to talk to you a little bit. Just wanted to let the listeners know that what I've heard discussed in terms of working with local communities and getting them the tools to come up with a proactive strategy to solve their water quality problems is something that the Department of Agriculture is really a big supporter of that approach. We now have several tools in the form of the Conservation Reserve Program and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program and other programs where we've told our people at the local level to work with the communities, with the conservation districts and the agricultural community, and to see what contribution agriculture is making in the water quality arena, and to go ahead and use our tools, our programs to help those communities solve those problems in as effective a manner as possible. These are big programs, and we know agriculture plays a large role in water quality, and we want our people to be able to work with agriculture and local communities to come up with solutions to the problems they face. We support the voluntary approach by and large, and but think that there's hybrids out there of regulatory and non-regulatory approaches, and our financial assistance and technical assistance and educational assistance can go a long way towards helping communities come up with real solutions. So we're happy to be part of this, and we're glad to hear this discussion happening today.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
I'm anxious to respond to that comment, and I'm glad Tom called in because the CRP program has been extremely useful in our areas where agriculture often is performed all the way up to the municipal boundaries. And the CRP programs do help drinking water quality. Minnesota's done some research on actual nitrate levels as they leach through cropland and compared to how they leach through the CRP program ground. And through cropland, the nitrate levels are 10 times higher than through CRP. So we're anxious to keep the CRP program going and effective. And I'd just like to encourage everybody to contact their local NRCS program leaders in their counties and find out about the sign-up parts of the 15th CRP entitlement, and check on a few other programs too. There's a couple new ones, EQUIP, and some states have set aside programs too with permanent easements, and these are really quite crucial in the ag areas.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. We have another call. No, we have a question. David, I think it's Nerfeld, is writing, he's faxing us from Canada, Ontario. He says, could you identify one of the most innovative and successful examples of growth management tools being applied to protect groundwater and on a regional scale, e.g. land acquisition, easements, zoning?
Well, all those tools, David, are appropriate. Land acquisition is probably the most appropriate because if the community, the city, the town, the province, provincial government owns land in fee, you own title to the property, you get to control it, and therefore we don't have to deal with issues of regulation and takings issues and other issues that are very much the forefront of discussion today in both countries. I've found that overlay zoning, marrying the science, the hydrogeology of delineating wellhead protection areas or watershed divides with zoning, with other regulatory controls, is probably the most effective. I don't know if it's the most innovative, but I think it's the most successful technique. Marrying science and regulation, science and law, is a very appropriate and defensible strategy for your groundwater program.
Dusty?
Those are some great points, John. And I'd like to add that we use an overlay district in our wellfield protection program. And of course, we have found it to be very effective in preventing unwanted new types of development activity. Now, one of the key pieces of that is sometimes if you're going to establish regulations and you're going to constrain some development, you need to also get innovative about how you offset the adverse impacts from those constraints. And we have what is one of the best programs in the country. It's called PROGRESS, which is also one of the greatest acronyms of all time, promoting regional opportunities for growth, recognizing environmentally sensitive settings. And that's an umbrella effort that helps us basically sustain our economic base through conservation easement acquisitions and actually doing some very proactive marketing for groundwater-friendly types of uses.
Okay, that was a mouthful. Thanks. You know, public education is a key element throughout the entire process. So now we're going to see how our communities use public education to build on the momentum of their efforts.
I guess more than anything else, we try to convey to individual citizens that they have a responsibility, and their individual acts make a big difference in protecting the water supply. When we dispose of oils and dispose of lubricants, when we use pesticides, the types of things that we put on our lawns, our own individual water use decisions, all those things have an impact on our water supply. So I think it's important that we all convey that individuals make a big difference in terms of protecting the overall water supply for the region.
Well, one of the important parts of the action strategy is public education program. And we view that as a kind of the responsibility of all the organizations. So Baltimore County and Carroll County each are implementing public education and awareness programs, as well as the Maryland Department of Agriculture and the other organizations. In terms of our collective effort, we also have emphasized public awareness. We've worked with Maryland Save Our Streams to put together a reservoir-wide watershed protection marketing effort.
The goals of our education programs are to really, one, make citizens aware of their dependency in relationship to the drinking water system. The second objective of our education program is to have citizens understand that the actions that they take individually around their home, their yard, in their communities can make a significant difference for water quality for everyone.
We want our students to be good communicators, to be able to communicate the need for protection of the aquifer, to communicate their needs to be responsible citizens in their community, to be able to express to others what they have learned and what impact that has on them.
We use a model of an aquifer. We have been using a large aquarium-type model, and we have just had donated from the Groundwater Foundation some jugs that are a model that are easily portable, and they'll be able to move around the school district. We have the children manipulate the model and make observations, make predictions, and we also use charts and maps of the area. We find where they are living in their community, whether they're above the aquifer area or not.
If you start with education, you can often prevent some of the problems with future problems with enforcement. You can get people to voluntarily comply with what might be a regulation later on, such as proper disposal, keep people from improper dumping and that kind of thing.
We just feel that all residents, all businesses should know about the aquifer and take whatever steps they can to protect it. We don't really want this to be a thing that City Hall does. And I think we're really making great strides at that. All of the businesses who take steps to protect the aquifer from hazardous chemicals, those are leaders in the community. There are those in that category who particularly stand out, who are active in the Chamber of Commerce and who are recognized as EnviroStars. These are people who have demonstrated that they implement best management practices to protect the aquifer.
I just really think you've got to get some committed people involved in a program and keep them abreast of it. Give them a small job to do, whether it's typing papers or handing things out, going door to door like we did on this survey, trying to find this drill and all. Just all sorts of ways to inspire people, mostly keeping them informed. Well, younger people at some of your clubs in high schools, you would be surprised. We generally tend to get an idea that there's just an awful lot of bad teenagers out there that don't want to do anything. If you go explore at some of your clubs at high school, you'll find out where some of the committed kids are, because they've sought those clubs out for a particular endeavor.
I feel that it especially relates to the chemistry courses, which certainly a majority of students are enrolled in, especially that participated in the survey. I think that learning about water contamination, about the wide range of possible contaminants, things that they hadn't even suspected before, was very educational to them in their courses and gave them a real-life application to what they were doing.
The city is trying to map out
all the wells in Sweeney. They started that last weekend. They had volunteers that came and surveyed a certain area in the city, and to find out where each well, where a well might be, or something that may be in the ground or around the area that could cause a problem with the wellhead protection.
I mean, this was a learning experience for me. I'm glad Tim asked me to do this because I was not aware of all the stuff that could be, you know, anything that has to do, you know, with the water. I had no idea there was that much.
We had an interesting time on the survey. Of course, in a small town, you know a lot of the people you were surveying, and we got invited in and chatted with quite a bit. We located some wells that we didn't know were there.
The mayor and city council in Sweeney, we're very fortunate that they also believe that education is very important. We take the funding for these programs out of our city budget. I think some of our goals with education and awareness building is just to make the public aware of what we've got and what we need to do. And I think it's important that you start with the kids. They're the ones that's going to be our future.
And here to talk more about public education is Ken. Ken, please elaborate.
Thanks, Doris. I think, as we learned in the last section, you can regulate for compliance, but you cannot regulate for commitment. Commitment is something you have to generate in the community, and it's really important. It really is a generation process. I hate to sound like Yogi Berra here, but, you know, but if it ain't known, it ain't known. You're going to have to go out there and make people aware. I think the councilwoman from Sweeney mentioned it, some folks from Texas mentioned it, that, boy, I wasn't aware until I got involved in the process. And it's that level of awareness that people start taking a look at how important is this to how we do business as a community. And education, in my experience, has been there are basically two levels that you go out. One is what I call awareness, and that's where you go out and simply provide people with some kind of understanding of the community's water supply and where it comes from, and so they have kind of what I call an aha. They go, aha, And then the next one is a level of education where you go to the decision makers, the Board of Health, the City Council, the County Commissioners, and you say, these are the fundamental aspects or parameters that you need to understand in your decision making. And then the other thing that has to come out of that, I think, are you need to develop a task force that you work with to bring your educational materials, to develop your educational materials. You need to be chronic, and I guess that's the only word I can think of. You really need to be chronic in your educational efforts. You need to be there all of the time. You need to do it consistently. It has to be a process and not an event. You have to be positive about it. There's no substitute for enthusiasm. You can't sell this product if you don't believe in it. And that's really what you're doing, is you're marketing through education. And I guess the last issue that I think is really important is you have to face all of the issues. Don't try and duck any of them. If there's things that are controversy, step up to the plate, and if we don't have an answer, tell folks we're going to develop an answer. And I guess with this, I'd like to turn to Bonnie, because I know you've worked with the Groundwater Foundation and Wisconsin. You've done a lot of educational things.
Well, it's Minnesota, but that's okay. We could go to Wisconsin, I'm sure, if asked.
They've been trying to get there all day.
I'd like to add one more bullet to your list of good ideas for education, and that would be to keep it universal. In our project, we've had a really good time working with all age groups, little bitty kids through senior citizens. We've worked with adult ed in the communities, helping promote lawn best management practices, because oftentimes agriculture in the Midwest and agricultural areas is zeroed in on, and we feel that groundwater protection is everybody's opportunity. I didn't say problem. And we have targeted kids in schools, as the video showed. We have farm fields that are demonstration projects so that we can have field days and have the farmers come out and view each other's work, and that's really neat. Another thing is the educational materials. As we all develop materials, they vary. This is one of our newest publications that kind of takes the positive approach. It's called Celebrate Water, and we highlight various projects going on throughout our area so that everybody has ownership of the good parts of water quality protection. And you've done a lot of work with the media in a very effective way.
Yeah, we consider educating your media representatives as one of the key pieces of getting your word out to the general public. But we'll also agree completely with what Bonnie just said about make sure that you can impact everybody. We're going to have a Children's Groundwater Festival this summer, so we'll be reaching out to the children. And we also target our regulated community with a newsletter that goes out quarterly and tells the people that we regulate what we're up to and what some of the incentives are in our program, so that they're absolutely aware of what's going on.
Okay, and the name of that newsletter is Progress News.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
Don't ask him the definition.
He gave it to us once, right? Okay, you know, this is one of the questions. I mean, certainly it's our responsibility to educate the adults, but you know, as was said earlier, it's the children. How do we really reach the children so that they understand how meaningful it's going to be for them to protect their water supply and water source?
Well, we work with the teachers. We have teacher workshops in the summer, and we have a number of pieces of equipment that the kids can use to play with, showing how the water in a watershed might filter down through the various geologic levels and reach the groundwater, and that's real effective. Toys are always a lot of fun. The Groundwater Festival is really taking off across America, and everybody's supportive of that.
You know, and the old teaching axiom is you tell them what you told them, then you tell them again. And I think you have to do it through various grades. So by the time they get through middle school or high school, they've heard this before. It becomes part of again, the fabric of how they think. We had a bunch of, the Division of Environmental Quality took a bunch of high school students out and started stenciling around old storm drains, saying, you know, this leads to your drinking water supply. Don't stuff down. Don't pour things down here. And it really caught on.
All right. Well, we would like to hear from those of you out there at the 700 sites that we have, so by all means, please give us a call. And while we're waiting for your calls, Dr. Wanzo from Brazil sends us a question. Tudo bem? And he says, considering the rapid growth of large metropolitan areas in developing countries and how difficult it is to protect groundwater, what advice do you have? Ken?
I think you have to start with defining the problem, and it's an educational thing. I don't think it's any different in Brazil than it is in the United States, and about 80% of what gets done by 20% of the people, and we found out that we had to start with the Lions, the Kiwanis, the League of Women Voters, the American Association of University Women, kind of work your way through the groups and bring them through that awareness and then educational stage. Then you've built this foundation on which you can make proposals for ordinances or comprehensive plans. But if you just go in cold, you know, people aren't that receptive if they don't understand.
Bonnie?
I think it's also important that some initial work be done to survey the folks and see what they don't know or what their basic knowledge levels are, maybe where they get their information, and then tailor your materials to meet those needs.
Okay. Ken, one of the things that you said a little earlier was that we need to look at our values. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think values are those things in the community that set us up for our decision making. You know, there's a wonderful definition by Dr. Fry that I used to work at. He said that values are learned, emotionally charged, enduring concepts that prepare you to act. So what you're doing is when you go back through your definitions, you start saying, okay, what's important to the community? And once you decide what's important, then you can decide where you want to go.
Okay. We have a call from Oklahoma. Thank you for calling. Please go ahead with your question.
Yes. Is there a clearinghouse that lists regional, state, and county agencies involved in water conservation and monitoring? We'd be especially interested in state-by-state listings.
I'd suggest that if they start with the regional EPA offices, you know, they keep, you know, they know who their particular agents are in that area, or your state agencies. There's a lot of communities or a lot of state agencies starting to put together a directory of folks, and you may have to work your way through it. There are different names used by different states at different times.
Okay, Oklahoma, thank you for your call. We have another call. This one comes to us from Knoxville, Tennessee. Please go ahead, Knoxville. Thank you for calling. Knoxville? Maybe they have water in their ears. Okay. Well, in that case, we'll take a fax. Rafael Rivera from Puerto Rico called, and he said, could you expand on examples of communities which have organized partnerships with public water systems in an effort to protect drinking water sources? Bonnie?
Yeah, I think it's real important to tie in all the efforts, the public health, the utilities, and so on, and promote a unified approach. And I think that's easier to do than most people think.
Okay. Well, it looks like Knoxville is back with us. Knoxville, please go ahead.
Hi. Our question is relative to how we educate more effectively adults in our community as well as administrators within our community about various water quality issues, not just the children.
Okay. Thanks, Knoxville.
Yeah, great question. I've often wondered why it is that our regulatory boards, our planning commissions, our boards of appeals, our boards of health, are the last people to understand what we're talking about. Why is it that our county commissioners, our council members, our mayors don't understand about groundwater protection and source water protection and watershed protection? So I agree with you. I think every regulatory board, every permit it issues has to be thinking or asking the question, how will this new development impact or conversely protect our water resources? If every board in every community in every county in every state did that, we would have far fewer incidents of groundwater contamination. I agree with you. It's a tremendous question. And maybe every state in every county should require that before you can become on a regulatory board, you have to take a course. You have to pass some certification. You have to understand what the connection between land use and groundwater quality is. And maybe that should be a prerequisite for being an elected official.
Ken?
One of the things that has worked well for us over the years is that we put on what I call a traveling show. We go to where they're already meeting. If you have a city council meeting and you have a presentation, then you get on their agenda. You go to the Planning and Zoning Commission. You go to the county commissioners. Those of you who are in this educational mode or in a regulatory agency, you have to go out and sell that product. You can't expect people to come to you. You have to be where they're already going to be at. Everybody has limited discretionary time. And so what we need to do is package it, bring it to them, and at the first level say you need to be aware, and I'm going to be back to explain the ramifications of this awareness to you at some point in the future.
Okay. Thanks, Ken. We're going to take another call from Hastings, Nebraska. Thank you for calling. Please go ahead.
Okay, am I on?
You're on.
Okay, my question is this. We have children's festivals and so forth. However, we have a real problem trying to get farmers more involved in the educational process. And many of our plans throughout the districts, NRDs, the number one component is the educational process. And it doesn't seem to really make a lot of difference planning winter meetings or summer meetings. We just don't seem to get the turnouts that we'd like to see. And I was wondering if you had any ideas how to accelerate the fact that we could probably and possibly get more farmers into sessions, group sessions, and so forth.
We've got the gist. Okay.
And that's a real tough question, a good question. I think you may need to bribe them with a good meal. Just keep them part of the process and try to make your invitation real sacco and something that will really grab their interest. And I hope that works for you.
All right. Hastings, thanks so much for calling us. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions right now, so we're going to move on. While land use planning and education are essential, water quality monitoring needs to occur continually throughout the life of the project. So let's look at how our 3 communities monitor their water supplies.
The goals of the water quality monitoring program for the city are to ensure that the water that we deliver to our customers is the best that we can. It is another goal is to detect any problems that may be occurring in the aquifer as early as possible so that we have time to react. Approximately 20% of the monitoring we do is above and beyond what's required by the Safe Drinking Water Act.
Our goal with the monitoring of the water is to see if anything changes. I think it's important to realize that to know if you have a problem is to know what you had before the problem was there. I think it's important to have good records on different chemical analysis. That way, each year, you can compare these analyses. If you see anything going up, then you know something is causing that. Some of the things we do to monitor the quality of the water within the city, the Texas Natural Resource Conservation Commission, they make yearly inspections on public water supplies in Texas. During that time, they take samples that they take to health department labs, and they run all sorts of tests on it to see if anything has filtered into the water supply. From a city standpoint, we use a private lab, and we also take raw water from our wells, and we take and have parameters run on that to see from year to year. We think it's important to get a record going so that you can take different tests each year and you can find out if anything has changed over the years.
The city has 15 to 16 monitoring stations that measure the quality of the water feeding into the reservoirs, and they have a series of in-lake monitoring stations that measure the quality of the water in the reservoirs at various depths. And it is important to maintain this over a longer period of time because rainfall and hydrologic phenomenon are extremely variable. In trying to determine trends, you really have to have a long-term monitoring program in place to identify that with the variations in rainfall.
The water quality monitoring that the county performs is, again, a couple different programs involved. One is the biological stream monitoring that I mentioned before, wherein we use citizen monitors to get a reading on the water quality of our streams. The thing that we feel is really most important about this program is that we have worked to put quality assurance and quality control procedures in place so that we have the confidence that the data that's collected by our citizens is as usable and reliable as data that would be collected by professionals.
Water quality monitoring is, I believe, a particularly important program for volunteers. Before you can fix a problem, you have to know what it is, and monitoring helps assess it. When we put in important water improvement projects, we have to know that they work, and monitoring allows us to check that and adjust the program. If we relied solely on government programs or professionals for monitoring, we'd see only a very small part of our water resources. So by using scientifically based volunteer programs, we can form partnerships between volunteers and professionals and agencies to assess and address the program. The volunteers find monitoring particularly satisfying because it's biological monitoring, and they pick up the little insects that live in the stream, and life connects to life. It's easier to start caring about your stream when you see the life start to thrive.
Okay, and Bonnie's going to help us now to look at some of the issues around monitoring.
Thank you, Doris. As with the land use and education components of a drinking water protection program, when it comes to water quality monitoring, one size doesn't fit all. The scope and extent of a maintenance monitoring program will vary from region to region, state to state, and even community to community. For example, the frequency of monitoring in our Texas case study would be too low in the Midwest and the Northern Plains, where nitrate fluctuates on a seasonal basis. As we've heard, many monitoring programs will also include assessments of water quantity. Some will involve looking at contaminant levels in surface waters and assessing interactions between groundwater and surface water. Some will be driven by state or federal requirements. Some will be simple. Some will be highly technical. For example, those using age dating to determine the residence time of water in recharge zones. As you saw in the Baltimore area, some communities make good use of volunteers. Some will use partnerships or teams to guide their monitoring efforts, and many communities will also make use of consultants for assistance. Although many communities participating today may be just starting out on their monitoring programs and establishing baseline conditions, including some of the communities joining us from Brazil, we want to look now at monitoring as an ongoing process throughout all phases of the drinking water program. Dusty, can you start us out on this dialogue?
Thanks, Bonnie. You know, we not only monitor individual production wells, like most of you do, but we also have 130 monitoring wells in what we call an early warning monitoring system. Now, those wells didn't all originate as early warning monitoring wells. Some of them went in very early as hydrogeologic assessment wells. Then we have wells near potential sources of contamination, some wells near existing sources of contamination, and then we have what we call gap fillers that are in areas that we might suspect contamination or we might suspect nothing, but we want to have some ongoing coverage. Then we have different frequencies of monitoring depending upon where the well is and what we're using it for. Everything from maybe twice a year to twice a day under some circumstances.
Okay. And by the way, I'd just like to take this opportunity. If you have any questions about monitoring, this would be the time to start calling in and, of course, sending in your faxes or your email. Okay, I'm sorry.
I think you need to also understand, those of you who are in this, moving into this program too, that those who have a scientific background never have enough data. You know, I mean, monitoring can become a black hole, and don't let it do that. Don't not do some things because you're monitoring or you're waiting for your monitoring results to come in. There are some prudent things that you can move forward, community involvement. You know, for the whole technical aspect of the problem, there's a social context that has to be addressed, and you have to marry those two. So as you're gathering data, as you're doing your monitoring, go out in the community and say, we're out there gathering data. This is what we expect to go with that. This is some of the options we think that'll be developed, so that you can do these simultaneously. It isn't a linear process. It has to be kind of like a mobile. You've got to balance it, and you've got to keep it moving all the time.
Part of the issue of monitoring, I think, is where does the community come up with the money to do ongoing monitoring? Yeah. Where does the funding come from? And not to stay on the regulatory bandwagon forever, but every opportunity a local government has to make a connection between a development permit and a monitoring requirement, the community will be better off. Every new special permit, special exception, conditional use permit that's required in your community could be connected to monitoring requirements or funding for monitoring requirements. Don't overlook that opportunity to take advantage of a developer and a community working in partnership for this kind of information.
Dusty?
There's an interesting point that I'd like to address to the reauthorization of the Safe Drinking Water Act, and that is that consumer confidence reports are coming. So you're going to be identifying for your consumers, those of you who are drinking water producers, exactly what contaminants are present in your system. I would suggest that when you're evaluating the scope of your monitoring program and the character of that program, that you consider that that's coming down the road and whether or not you're going to be able to answer the questions that your consumers are inevitably going to ask about where those contaminants are coming from.
Bonnie?
And if we could jump off the regulatory bandwagon for just a minute, our area has had quite a bit of success in using monitoring results as an educational process. We have a voluntary private well program that has enlisted 3,500 families, and we can use those testing events as an opportunity for education as well.
Okay. Let's take a fax question. S. Cheng from Dayton, Ohio would like to know, how do you decide sampling locations, frequency, and analytes for a water quality program?
What a great question from Dayton, Ohio.
It was just for you, Dusty.
Thank you. Not a plant. Let me suggest that initially you want to do a very wide range of testing, particularly if you don't understand exactly what your problems might be. By doing that broader scope of testing, you can begin to narrow down on the types of chemicals that might cause particular problems in your aquifer setting and whatever the particulars of that setting might be. Then we advocate that you go for the most cost-effective monitoring strategies that you can employ, including field screening. Obviously, those don't meet certain regulatory requirements, but nevertheless, they can provide very, very useful information to help make local management decisions.
Bonnie?
Some of our communities may also need to work with surface water monitoring because in many areas the surface and groundwater interact. And I think if you look at critical points in the watershed, that is a good way to determine sampling sites.
Ken?
And for some communities that don't have a lot of resources, understand that You can go to the universities. We've done some work with the University of Idaho where they have developed master's and doctoral programs, done the monitoring, and then fed that information back to the community. And that gives you a disinterested source doing that evaluation for you, which is a good resource if you don't have a lot of money.
Okay. Again, we urge you to give us a telephone call with a question, and we're talking about monitoring right now. Let's take a call coming to us now from Las Vegas, Nevada. Please go ahead, Las Vegas.
Yes. Do most cities and counties test and analyze their samples in their own labs, or are independent labs more common?
Don't everybody jump at once.
We've used a marriage of both. We've used the state labs, and out of the Silver Valley in that area, we've used a local lab. So and sometimes you'll double sample, get check samples to go back one against the other.
That's a good point, Ken. We not only use outside laboratories, but we also use inside laboratories, and we also use mobile laboratories, and those are particularly beneficial to us on emergency response activities.
Bonnie, what are you all doing?
Same with our area. What they said.
Okay. All right. We have another question. This one kind of in the same family as the other. There's so many different chemicals that water can be tested for. How can a community with multitude of private wells determine what tests to run?
First samples we ever sent in, we used to mark them ATKM, all tests known to man. You know? But,
how much did that cost?
I think that's where you need to access at that level someone who has expertise in the area, understands to some degree your geology or what your history be, and give you maybe the top 4 or 5 pertinent ones to take a look at. Universities, again, are a great place to go for that. Your state agencies, there are consultants out there that can work with you.
Dustin.
And I think it's important to also remember that most of you have inventory information already. So look at that inventory information and the character of the types of contaminants associated with those potential sources of contamination, and tailor your program around those. There's reams of data out and about the types of contaminants that come from specific types of use of the land.
John?
Well, I just want to add, the whole issue of monitoring I find in many cases very disconcerting, because by the time you detect something in your monitoring wells, it's too late in many respects. And the purpose of groundwater protection is groundwater protection, not groundwater remediation. So remember that you can have the best, most sophisticated, most well-funded monitoring program in the country, and you can have contaminated groundwater. So it's a backup system, it's an emergency system. It's not a wellhead protection plan.
Okay, Ken?
Yeah, but I think it's also a dashboard mentality too. You can get an idea of if something's going bad in the system while you're trying to address your other problems. Again, I like the mobile concept. It's all a part of that system.
Okay, let's take another telephone call. This one comes to us from Kansas City, Kansas. Thank you for calling. Please go ahead with your question.
Good afternoon. I was wondering if the monitoring programs consider as important the temperature of surface water as a factor related to aquatic quality, not only biological quality, but the viability as it relates to drinking water supplies taken from surface waters.
Boy, that's not an arena that we've done a lot of work with. Spokane County has a significant interchange between the surface water system and the groundwater system. But temperature has not been a primary issue, especially in the northern tier states that we've worked in.
Bonnie?
We've done a little bit of work with temperature because it helps us determine the recharge of the surface water from the groundwater. In Minnesota, the groundwater is warmer in the winter and vice versa. I don't think that's a good answer to his question, but
okay,
it was a good, tough question.
Well, Kansas City, thank you for that tough question. Let's take our next call from my hometown, Detroit, Michigan. Please go ahead.
Yes, hi. This is Adele Pleatney calling from Detroit, and I'm concerned about any community presently that monitors during a real-time storm event what surface water contaminants or runoff contaminants are occurring, and could they then identify them back to either a point source or a non-point source, because that truly is the one conduit for contaminants to enter our raw water supply.
Ken?
Yeah, that's excellent. I think sometimes we forget that 80% of the contaminants in a storm event come off during the first half inches of the storm event. And, you know, we have gone to working in areas on our aquifer where we have a grassy swale system, where we try to run the stormwater into that swale system to try to trap those contaminants in that biological mat. But storm episodes, especially if there's a large interval between them, can be major impact on surface and groundwater systems.
Bonnie?
You can look at your sediment levels and determine what nutrients are tied to the sediments. You can also measure the quantities that come out and determine loading rates, and that's real critical in southern Minnesota.
Okay. Detroit, thank you so much for your question. Of course, even the best land use, monitoring, and education strategies can't prepare your community for every possibility. How do you deal with emergencies or problems that arise? How do you address future water supply needs? Let's look.
The Department of Environment has a group that responds to spills, not only on the reservoirs, but on streets and basically, and they also have the ability to call consultants who specialize in this area to deal with that particular emergency, to isolate that emergency so it doesn't spread. Then we can deal with it from that basis.
Dealing with contingencies, especially chemical emergencies in the drinking water reservoir, is something that is generally well set up across Maryland in terms of response units by the state agencies, and the county participates in those activities. Our department, for example, has an emergency response capability, and we're right there with the Department of the Environment whenever something happens.
We also have a reservoir, it's called Piney Run. It's in near Liberty Reservoir that a pipeline goes real close by, Colonial Pipeline. And we spoke with them and got them to donate some funds so that we could have a portable response system that the fire companies in Carroll County can use in case of any kind of emergency. And they also are getting training for those that are within the reservoir watersheds.
What we're looking to do, though, now is to, through our NPDES stormwater permit program, is to look very carefully at industries in all of our watersheds and look at their management programs for things like education of employees and protocols and site design and changes that may reduce the likelihood of any kind of releases from the site, as well as their emergency response plans.
Yes, we've had incidents at gas stations, one of which where a tanker truck spilled about 600 to 800 gallons of fuel, which went down an open ditch, and our response initially, our first concern, of course, was the fire problem as it went into the storm drain, and second of all was for mitigation of the environmental damage. Our initial crews on location recognized from their training what the correct response would be and procedure to mitigate the incident. Additional crews were called in, including the hazardous materials team, and we were able to confine and contain the spill. Both during and after the incident, we make contact with our water utilities as well as the street and sewer departments within the city and with the DOT from the state. We then allow them to be involved in the situation and correcting the problem and knowing what the hazard was, and so they can make sure that they trace and look for the problem, whether it's totally been mitigated.
First of all, anytime that there is any type of not confirmed, even a reported release of a hazardous material, we treat it just as seriously as we would a heart attack or a structure fire. We respond with a hazardous materials unit, and most often, if it's a confirmed release, a full structural response, which is up to 13 to 15 people, initially to, first of all, identify what the problem is, what type of material has been released, and what the hazards are to the environment and also to people in the area. And in doing that, in keeping it a very consistent response, we become very adept and proficient at dealing with these types of emergencies.
This is our hazardous material compliance plan, and it's an emergency plan in case there is a spillage, accident prevention plan, hazardous communications plan, dangerous waste management, and employee and training and documentation.
Currently, we are inside the City of Renton Maplewood Water Treatment Facility and Booster Pump Station, and it's located within the golf course that the City of Renton currently owns and operates. Basically, before the construction of this facility, The rainwater supply comes from a shallow aquifer in the downtown area. As you know, since it's shallow, it is very susceptible to contamination.
The railroad is checked 4 times a week. We have a track master coming in from Angleton and takes care of that. He reports back, I guess, to the head office of the railroad to see if any problems, and at the same time he'd get together with us. We're trying to block a potential contamination. We at the city, we are always cutting the bar ditches, and the spare dirt that we do have, if we're not using it for some other purpose, we'll actually just build a levee. It's just a mound of dirt, a couple of feet high, just something to deter in case we do have a spillage, it'll be contained.
Having the number of petrochemical plants that we have in the immediate area, we work very closely with their environmental protection people. They all have departments which deal with this sort of thing, and we work closely with those to be sure that that in the event of any hazardous spills, that they're properly involved, that everybody has is aware of what types of things are. If we can't identify them, then we call in one of their experts to help us identify any type of a spill and to keep each other apprised of what we're doing.
Some of our efforts to plan for an emergency should it happen, I guess we were one of the first cities to ever do a wellhead protection plan drill. Every 2 years we have a drill in Sweeney to test our emergency responses, not only to wellhead protection, but to hurricanes, natural disasters, whatever. We took and got with all of these other agencies, the fire departments, Phillips, Amoco, Sweeney Hospital, just all the groups within our area, and we put together a plan with the Sweeney Police Department. And part of this, we wanted to test what would happen in case of a groundwater contamination. During this, we found that we had a long ways to go. City response teams, they did the job, they took care of the patients, but they didn't do exactly what we would have liked for them to do as far as the hazardous spill. But we all learned from this, we talked about it through our critiques, and we think that we're much better off for it.
All right, Dusty, let's talk about contingency planning.
Thank you, Doris. It's a wonderful thing to see fire officials talking about water resources protection. You know, that's something that every one of you can make happen starting tomorrow. Call your fire chief, set a meeting to talk about the special procedures for spill response and other emergencies which might arise near your drinking water supplies. Take a map with you, invite your water supplier and your environmental regulators as well. You've got automobile insurance, health insurance, homeowners insurance, life insurance. For every other contingency in your life, why shouldn't you have one for your drinking water? Contingency planning is the foundation of comprehensive drinking water protection programs. By playing out your what-ifs based on your potential sources, the gaps in your safety net will become clear. Then your first instinct should be to minimize those gaps using the prevention tools that you've already heard about today. When you see what gaps are left, you'll want to address those remaining gaps by increasing your emergency response capabilities, and then consider backing up your emergency response capabilities with an alternative source of water, if, of course, you're lucky enough to have one available. Contingency planning can set the stage for your prevention decisions. You'll find that there's an inverse relationship. In other words, weaker protection measures require stronger response capacity. For example, it's been our experience in Dayton that less effective strategies, for example, engineering controls instead of land use regulations, in fact, drive the need for aggressive emergency response capabilities. Now, Ken, flooding has been of great interest here lately. Could you share some thoughts on contingency planning as it relates to flood events?
Yeah, in North Idaho, in Idaho in general, but in North Idaho in the last couple of years, we've had some significant floods. And we found out that in the smaller communities, we had to go to a contingency plan that consisted of using water buffaloes from the National Guard or bringing in tanker trucks so you could have culinary water. I don't think it's a good time at that time to start either testing the well field or pumping those wells and kind of let the flood subside before you start dealing with it. There was a point you brought up I wanted to go back to. You were talking about contingency planning and then prevention strategies. One of the things you can do, and one thing that's worked well for us, is to deal with what we call secondary containment in commercial or industrial facilities. In other words, if someone has potentially hazardous or dangerous chemicals, to have them secondarily contained during the handling process, so that you don't end up with fugitive fluids that can escape to the groundwater system. That's a good way to tie in your prevention with contingency by saying, if this becomes fugitive, this is how we're going to have to deal with it, and you can prevent that from happening.
Okay. We have a telephone call waiting for us. Olympia, Washington, please go ahead. Thank you for calling.
Yes, good afternoon. I want to thank the panel very much for their input, and I have some questions regarding railroads. We have a railroad running through our wellhead protection area, and we have had a derailment in the past in that area, but we still have difficulty getting the railroad company to come to the table to talk seriously about wellhead protection planning. Do you have any hints that we can improve our success in this area?
That's a great question. It's probably been, I guess 3 weeks now since I was on an emergency response associated with railroad transportation. We've developed, over time, a great working relationship with the railroad that operates within our wellfield protection area. In the last spill event, they were willing to pull up track, remove dirt, basically disable a significant portion of their operation for a given period of time. You need to keep talking with them, help them to understand that it's in their best interest to work with you to make sure that any accidents they have are absolutely minimized in terms of their impact.
John.
Just to add to Dusty's comment, which is, I think, an excellent response, their liability, a railroad's liability or any private sector operator's liability is extremely high. They need to know. They need to know that they're on the hook if a spill occurs, if a municipal or private water supply is contaminated. So part of the issue is making sure that they understand their responsibilities and, worst case, their liability should a contamination event occur. It's a good question.
Ken?
Yeah, I want to echo what John just said. That's true. We found out that you also have to be persistent when you deal with them. You have to let them know that you're going to be there and you're going to follow up on this, and if it becomes a problem, you're going to be back.
Okay. Olympia, thank you for your call. We'll take our next call from Claremont, California. Please go ahead. Thanks for calling.
Southern California relies on water imported from sources hundreds of miles away through aqueducts. Do panelists have any suggestions for contingencies when the water source is out of local control?
I think that question, that's a great question, and I think it goes actually to the bigger picture of managing groundwater, surface water resources that you don't have control over. And part of it is the good neighbor policy that community A, whose water is drawn from community B, needs to talk to community B. I think that's part of what you're asking as well in terms of contingency planning. It's communication if the regulatory environment isn't such that you have control over that upstream or upgrading community, which I suspect you don't. So the only, and I say only in a very positive sense, the technique might be simple negotiation and contribution with the other community, conversations with the other community to make sure they understand that your drinking water supply is 200 miles down gradient or downstream.
Dusty.
And there are a number of other opportunities to have those sorts of discussions which occur across jurisdictional boundaries. Everybody has a local emergency response council. Those can get connected and dialogue. Most of the EPA emergency response capability, whether it be state or federal, cross jurisdictional boundaries. For example, we have a real good working relationship with Ohio EPA, who lets us know anytime there's a problem upstream in the river that might eventually impact recharge and have an adverse effect on our groundwater. They let us know in advance that it's coming, regardless of how far away it is.
Bonnie?
I just want to add a little note. One day I saw a bumper sticker that said, "We all live upstream," and I like that concept. It kind of defines us holistically.
Mm-hmm. Ken?
Yeah, I think that's true. We need to, I guess what I'm trying to reiterate here is that this is a process. It's not an event. You're going to have to enter these dialogues. You're going to have to re-enter them every time commissions change or city councils. You have to go back through this learning curve, and that's why earlier on we talked about education. It's a chronic event. It's chronic, and you need to be aware when you go into this thing that it's not just going to happen and you're going to put it on the shelf. You're going to have to maintain it, you're going to have to care it, you're going to have to nurture it, and carry it into the next decades.
Okay. Well, we'd like to thank Claremont for that call, and we encourage the rest of you to call in. We are talking about contingency planning. I have a question here. It says, can a community conduct contingency planning if the water supply consists of numerous private wells? Dusty?
I think it's especially important if your community water system consists of numerous wells to do that planning, whether they're spatially together or spread across the region. You need to identify where those wells are and work with the respective emergency responders, if you're in different emergency response jurisdictions, to make sure that they're aware those wells are there. Maps are very useful. Contact information is absolutely essential. You don't have to build a real fancy program to have the fire official know how to contact you if you have useful information in the event of a spill near a drinking water source.
John?
My guess is well over half of those of you watching today rely on private wells for drinking water supply. All of the techniques, all of the strategies, all of the tools used for wellhead protection for a public water supply apply to private wells. They have to be tweaked, they have to be fine-tuned, but the techniques and the approach applies to private supplies. So the fact that you have no public supply in your community should not limit you in terms of groundwater protection. You're dealing with a more limited supply, but you're dealing with the same approach as you would if it were a public water supply.
Ken?
I want to go back to one of Dusty's comments where he said that, you know, tie the fire department in. You can offer something to the fire department. One of the things we've done from a health standpoint, and groundwater is very much a health issue, is that we inventory these facilities and through that inventory, tell the local fire department where this stuff is, how much of it's there, and where it's located. So then the local fire department has this knowledge that they can start planning a response if they need to. And so there's a feedback loop that benefits them.
Okay, Bonnie.
This is not exactly on that topic, but I just thought that maybe we should mention in flyover land, middle Minnesota, or middle America, actually, the importance of folks in maintaining their septic systems and getting those up to speed, because that vast non-point source is very large and very important.
Okay. We have a fax from Kate Kahn, and Kate says, you mentioned emergency response teams. What kind of emergencies might affect drinking water quality? How do people protect water from hazards caused by emergencies?
Well,
Start with you, Dusty.
Obviously, there's a whole host of different types of things that can ultimately impact you depending upon what type of development that you have. Everything from lots of different types of bugs that can get in your system because of flooding or washout on feedlots, excessive sorts of agricultural discharges. We've seen fires, all kinds of spills, transportation related and otherwise. And our team approach essentially means that you have people that are familiar with the water supply and the water supply needs and the vulnerabilities, working with the local emergency responders who ultimately control every action that occurs in one of those types of emergencies. And let me add, there are times when, if you're monitoring groundwater, you will face other kinds of emergencies besides your typical explosion, fires, or transportation accidents. You may just have something show up in a monitoring well that requires immediate response. You won't require a very close working relationship with your fire official in that case, but you should be prepared to implement a response. You may need to work with a regional, state, or federal agency to do that. We've developed our own capability to conduct emergency responses to plumes of groundwater contamination in Dayton.
Okay, John?
Many emergencies are predictable, and I guess one question I'd like to ask everyone to consider is to take a look at your zoning ordinance, your zoning bylaw, your regulatory tools, and you can probably make a prediction about development in the future if that development is within a wellhead protection area, a groundwater protection area. You can predict emergencies, you can predict catastrophes in many respects, and it can be avoided, particularly if you take a look at your zoning, your regulatory blueprint, marry that to your groundwater protection area, and make sure the two are in sync.
All right, let's take a telephone call from Sarah, Oklahoma. Please go ahead. Thanks for calling.
Yes, I was interested on how to develop contingency planning on the effects of aerial spraying in reference to herbicides and pesticides.
Dusty?
That's a good question. I think we're back to needing to have a fairly aggressive monitoring program. Obviously identify the areas where you're vulnerable and conduct monitoring in those areas. We have for example, a great working relationship with our golf course that operates adjacent to some public water supply wells. They let us know when they're spraying, and we follow up their spraying with some shallow groundwater testing. And if we need to respond to their activities, we do. Fortunately, over time now, we've developed an information base that says during the application of pesticides using best management practices, we're not seeing a problem. However, we understand that something could happen. An applicator truck or vehicle could crash and spill, and then you've got a completely different scenario that requires a very aggressive response. You may need to dig dirt, remove dirt. You may need to get into some proactive extraction of contaminated groundwater, and you need to make sure that you've got a place for that contaminated groundwater to go in the event that type of accident occurs.
Thank you very much for that telephone call. Thank you for the answer. We're going to take an opportunity now before we close the program to have a very quick summary from each of you. Ken, I'll start with you.
Groundwater is important. It's part of the fabric of your community. It may well be becoming some of the limiting factors to what your community can be in the future. If you're not doing something with it, you need to. You can't afford not to.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. John.
Thank you, Doris. I want to thank the League of Women Voters for inviting us all here today. I want to repeat what I said at the very beginning. Land use planning is where it's at. Land use planning is groundwater protection. It's common sense. It's taking advantage of the power and opportunities given to you as local officials, local governments, by the state and federal government, and it's public education. It's teaching all of us that groundwater has to be protected.
Bonnie?
Thank you for the opportunity as well, and I just want to encourage people to work well together. And it may seem like a long journey, but you can enjoy the trip.
Four quick things. Number one is that spills happen.
Okay.
This is obviously a paraphrase of a very popular bumper sticker. Number two, be prepared for those spills. Number three, you've got the tools to address your problems. Focus on prevention if you can. If you have to implement a contingency, you've probably failed to prevent an accident. And lastly, thank you very much to the League for the invitation to be here.
Now, if you'd like more information or you have questions that were not answered, or if you'd like information on obtaining a copy of this program, you can visit our webpage, www.drinkingwater.org, and then select Ask the Experts or call the EPA Safe Drinking Water Hotline at 1-800-426-4791. Information is also available from the National Drinking Water Clearinghouse, 1-800-624-8300. And I would like to say thank you for all of my panelists, my wonderful panel of experts. Thank you for the League, to the League of Women Voters. I'm Doris McMillan. Have a great day.
I would hope that everybody in this area would realize how important water is, how important it is to conserve it, first of all, to not waste it, how important it is to protect it, to not contaminate it, how important it is to measure our use, to get a handle on what is coming from the many, many unrecorded wells in this area, to quantify as well as qualify our water supplies. Because if they run out, we're out of luck. We need them. Our grandchildren need them. We have to protect them.
Once people buy into the fact that they do have ownership of that supply and that they can reduce the cost even of treatment by how they manage their land, then I think you've got a much more success or chance for success.
Start out simple. You learn each year that you go along, not to expect to solve all your problems at one time.
I would say get involved. Don't take for granted anything that affects your water supply, because there's a limited supply of it. And if you don't protect what you have, if you don't ferret out those things which could possibly contaminate your water supply, then this is the time to get involved.
Working with the City of Baltimore and the surrounding counties in protecting the drinking water system, I think, has helped us all. And I think the largest way that it helps us all is realizing that the physical resource is not bound by the political jurisdictions, that we can't just say that this is a city problem or a county problem, because the watersheds extend across all these jurisdictions.